Hi there, everybody. I'm Jeff Mayers from WisPolitics.com and StateAffairs.com. If you don't know about State Affairs, it's a nonpartisan network of news organizations around the country, going from Massachusetts all the way to California. And you can find out more at StateAffairs.com. I want to thank our sponsors for this event. University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, the Medical College of Wisconsin, Wisconsin Transportation Builders Association, and HBS Wisconsin. Thank you, sponsors. They're sponsors of our Milwaukee series of events. So the format for today is I ask our special guests and experts about what's going on, and then you folks get to ask questions, and the way you do that is enter your question into the chat. So let me introduce our panel of experts here. I think you know them, but I'm going to tell you about them anyway. We have Tanya Bjork. She's a longtime Democratic strategist and a good friend here in Wisconsin. Keith Gilkes. He's a Republican and a founder of Platform Communications. So check out Platform Communications. And Charles Franklin. He's director of the Marquette University Law School poll. Welcome, everyone. So, okay, my first question is what the hell happened? And so I'm going to start with Charles because I think Charles has something to say about polling too. Charles, take it away.
Yeah, Jeff manages to cut to the chase right here at the top, right? Um, Look, I think the results surprised people. Um, but the question is, what was surprising and why was it surprising? It was surprising because Fran Hung had run at the head of the pack all year. Um, and we ended up with a virtual tie that David Crowley won. People didn't see that coming. Polls didn't see that coming in a big sense. But I want to push back a little bit on the headline in the New York Times front page that why were the polls so wrong in Wisconsin? And this applies to the other polls that were done here as well as mine, though obviously I'll talk about mine. Um, our final poll ended on July 27th. Mandela Barnes dropped out on July 30th. You may have heard that other people dropped out and then dropped back in on the race during July. This is an unusually dynamic primary with changes of candidates, not to mention the late Evers endorsement in the race, and some last week or two news stories about Fran Hong as well as other just campaign events. So I think my main point here is do readers of polls and for that matter punditry expect a crystal ball or expect an analysis of where the race is at the time that we're writing? I wish we were in person because I'd like to see a show of hands of how many people on July 27th knew this was going to be a very tight race in a virtual tie. Come on, put your hands up. You can do it. You knew it on the 27th. You did not know it on the 27th. Nobody knew it on the 27th. Things happened after that. So let me just briefly say where I think the polls were right and where they weren't so right or just dead wrong. But I want to put it in that perspective of what do we know on the 27th and what happens after that. So on the 27th, we had Fran Hong at 38% in our final poll. She ended up with 39.3% of the vote. We had David Crowley at 7%. He did a whole lot better than 7%. And we also had Mandela Barnes, who was then still in the race, at 16%. But the really important number was 34%. That was the percentage that were undecided on the 27th. Now, there was a lot of online punditry, the source of all truth, of course, that said there's no way 34% are undecided in this race. Well, I think the outcome of the race and what happened in the last 2.5 weeks of the campaign is pretty good evidence that there actually were a lot of undecided voters, not to mention Barnes dropping out, redistributing his 16%. And I want to close with this point that we made at the time of that 20, July 27th release, and also made twice in the week leading up to the uh, primary. And that was that Hong was strongest with young voters and very liberal voters. She was much, much weaker with older voters and with moderate voters. And the old and the moderate were the most undecided voters and the least supportive of her. So we pointed out that there's potential here for movement. We did not use the crystal ball to say, therefore, that will be the movement that will produce a tie. But I think the polling was good, and this is again not just mine, but others, that showed that there was room for movement and that Hong was not at 50% or something. She was in the high 30s or the low 40s, depending on the poll. But that substantial undecided, and especially the groups that were most undecided, was the real potential source for movement. Then finally, toss in the last 2 weeks of the campaign. And especially for this audience, I would just ask if you think campaigns don't matter and that where a race stands 2.5 or 3 weeks before election day has to be the way it's going to turn out, then what are you in the campaign business for at all if you don't think campaigns matter? They do matter. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes things are pretty stable through to the end. But in primaries, especially, and God knows in this year's primary, you ought to expect big campaign effects. And you also have to take account that Wisconsin voters are not like everybody on this webinar. Wisconsin voters take a long time to make up their mind, even in a normal primary. And this year, that was especially late for folks to decide who they were going to vote for.
Okay, thanks, Charles. I got just a couple quick things to add. I mean, primary polling is especially squishy, right? I mean, I think we've seen that again and again. So you always have to think about when did the poll come out of the field, not when it was announced or when it was distributed. And polls are a snapshot in time. They're not supposed to be predictive. You want to watch the trend line. And this was an especially late breaking primary. My gosh. Okay, so let's go to Keith. What the hell happened? You didn't get your preferred candidate. Are Republicans now panicking?
No, ultimately, our primary went spectacularly smooth. So Republicans did a great job, and there was no controversy with it whatsoever. So kudos to the Republicans on that front. From our perspective, we knew there was always a chance that this could jumble up a couple more times before election day. I agree with some of the elements of what Charles laid out in terms of, where people broke and in terms of where they were going to vote with Dem primary voters. And the reality was we needed to be prepared for every candidate to potentially be the nominee. Sometimes you wrote somebody off and sometimes they came back. As all the comments noted here, this was a wild ride. I'm a casual observer from the outside. I do think there was, a number of voters in the Dem primary who were probably sitting back, taking stock, waiting till the very last minute. And as a result of that, they saw some of the things that maybe from Francesca Hong's social media, from the national interviews that caused them some consternation and pause. And then ultimately they decided to get behind David Crowley. The reality though is, this was a very small margin and it showed that she had a very strong campaign. And I think some of the early leads that people saw in polls last year into the beginning of this year, people just dismissed it. But the reality is there is a segment in the Democratic primary universe that is very responsive to Francesca Hong, her platform, and the self-avowed Democrat socialist element of the Dem Party. So it'll be something that will be dealt with in the course of the general election, and we look forward to it.
Okay, so we'll talk about the Democratic Socialist movement a little bit later here. But Tanya, we started with seven candidates, ended up with one. and the candidate who won had dropped out a month earlier. So I don't think that's ever happened
Yeah.
before. Okay, so what the hell happened? How did Crowley,
Y-
manage to?
Yeah, the Crowley comeback. The
Yeah,
Crowley comeback. Yeah, the comeback kid. Well, I think a big piece of it is timing is everything in politics. And I think David Crowley was able to take advantage of all of the upheaval and the attention that that was getting with the other primary or with the other candidates. And I don't think we can discount the Evers bump. The Evers endorsement was a very big boost, particularly after he had come out and said that he wasn't going to endorse in the primary, and all of this stuff happened, and then came out that you cannot discount or undercount the value of the Evers endorsement. I also think, again, back to timing, it was like kind of like the perfect time to come back into the race because of all the attention that the primary was getting. And but they had just enough time to be able to put the money together too. I think that was the other thing that, sort of folks were a little bit worried about. It doesn't, putting together the money that you need to close strong in a primary or any election is hard to do. And I think he had just enough time to do that. And I think that was coupled with some of the missteps that I think the Hahn campaign made, the big oppo dump of all the tweets and all that got all of the attention that got. And I think people are desperate to keep the governor's seat in Democratic hands. And I think at the end of the day, a lot of the voters the undecided voters who maybe were thinking, maybe Hong is my choice. Maybe it is time to go in a different direction. I think after all this happened and after the Evers endorsement, I think it was perfect timing.
so yeah,
And he
Evers
closed
actually.
strong. I mean, they campaigned across the state together. He did it on his own when the governor was out of the country, but then they, barnstormed the state together. And I have to give some credit to the Evers team, not just for coming out and doing the endorsement, but they never wavered. I mean, once they decided that this is what they were going to do, they did it. Bad poll numbers came out, didn't stop. Oppo research dump kept going. They saw it through, and I think it was a real testament to their discipline. And also, based on polling, and Charles can confirm this, but Tony Evers is the most popular politician we've seen in Wisconsin for quite some time. So I think that's the story of the Crowley comeback.
Right. Now, let's not discount the money factor here. Hong didn't have any money to defend herself or to maybe right the ship when the Thanksgiving stuff came down, right? And so, but Crowley had and his forces had millions of dollars at their disposal. So that obviously made a difference, right?
Made a big difference.
Okay. All right. Now let's talk about, a little more on that Evers effect. I think he's the most popular politician in Wisconsin. And so I think that in, one of your polls, Charles, the effect of the endorsement was, I think, understated at the time, but it seemed to uh, grow as attention came on to the primary.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. In our poll that was done July 22nd through the 27th, so that's after Crowley got back in the race, after the Evers endorsement, though it was pretty early. We were in the field the week after he returned to the race. Um, what we found was that 36% of primary voters said that Evers' endorsement made them more likely to vote for David Crowley. Now, 52% said it didn't make any difference, and the rest said it made them less likely. Those were mostly loyalists to other candidates who were discounting it. But on the popularity thing, you're right that Evers is the most popular politician with all registered voters, consistently just a little bit above 50% job approval. Um, but among Democratic primary voters, his job approval was 89% in that poll. So you're looking at an extraordinarily popular governor within the party, and he's giving you advice about how to vote. Now, we in that poll only had Crowley at 7%, but 36% said it was going to influence them or was influencing them. They hadn't yet made a move, but again, it showed the potential was there. But I think it also showed that at that point, a week after Crowley got back in, it hadn't yet had its effect, but it did show that that potential was there. And the enormous popularity of Evers within the primary voter group, big deal.
Okay, so
I also think
now,
I just have to
okay,
add to that too. I just want to add one thing to that too. I think, this could have gone two ways, right? The Evers endorsement could have been just an endorsement on paper. Yep, this is who I'm supporting. But that's not what happened. Evers did ads, did interviews, did, barnstormed the state. And I think that is what really sort of, it wasn't just a paper endorsement. And I think that made a big difference.
all right. What's your view, Keith? What did the Evers endorsement mean in the primary? And then we will get to what it might mean in the general.
Well, from my perspective, endorsements usually within primaries are validators, which is just simply to say, this is a person like me, and if that's what you want, then you should vote for them. And so at this particular juncture of the primary, in terms of when the endorsement came, I think those undecideds that we've been talking about in all the polling looked at the Evers endorsement as kind of a way to gauge, does David Crowley pass the test of, a guy who can win, who's a moderate, that comes across that way, et cetera. And that's what Evers' endorsement brings to the table. To Tanya's point, anytime you can get somebody that has a positive image with the general electorate and a very good positive image within the party, that's going to be a benefit. I am always cautious about endorsements because I don't believe they ultimately sway elections and sway voters, but they help voters make decisions. So, and especially in a primary as opposed to the general, which we can talk about later. But that's what I think is probably, a good way to look at it in terms of a primary election, at least.
Charles?
Yeah, I agree with that. In that early July poll, we found 80% said it was extremely or very important in choosing a candidate to have someone that can win in November. That's the electability argument that you heard a lot about, and I think you heard a lot about kind of late in the campaign. I also want to toss out one point that I don't think I've heard anybody else say, and that was this $3 million plus ad campaign from Republicans branding Francesca Hong as too liberal and listing her opposition to Trump and her opposition to ICE. At least the public punditry about that was that it was intended to boost her with Democratic primary voters who also don't like Trump and also don't like ICE. But I think the tagline may have actually ended up hurting her, branding her as too liberal for Wisconsin. There's a potent argument on the electability side. And the premise of the ad sort of assumes that all Democratic voters would just flock to the anti-Trump, anti-ICE and not be scared by the liberal brand. But you couple that with electability and that 34% undecided that I keep coming back to. And I think it's actually quite possible. We probably never know, but I think it's possible that those ads actually helped undecided voters worry more about her being too liberal for the state, and that also helped them look for an alternative candidate. Coupled with the Evers endorsement in the last minute campaign and Hong's missteps on national interviews, I think all of that kind of conspired to help Crowley, even though the ad campaign was presumably intended to help Hong.
Okay, so Democrats were getting a
can I
preview.
just add to that?
Yeah,
I
I'm
just want
just
to add to
saying.
that to say,
Yeah,
I
I'm
was
just
just going to
saying
say,
the
I just want to
Democrats
I
are
think
getting a
that
preview of what would come in the general election.
I think that's part of it. I also think that ad could have been a lot more effective had it not gone so far. I actually think the more important thing that the Tiffany campaign did early on was, quote unquote, leak the memo that said that they were most scared of running against her in that part. That had that been the tact that they might have taken the rest of the way through and not gone too far on the she's too liberal, that might have worked. And in a race that's decided between, what, less than 3,000 votes out of a statewide race. I mean, that could have made the difference right there. I think they overstepped though, with that ad. So Charles, I'm glad you brought that up.
I'm sorry I talked over you there, Tanya.
That's okay.
Okay, before we move on to the general, though, I want to talk about Hong's campaign and what it might mean for Democrats. So, like the Democratic moderates seem to be resisting this around the country. This is a danger, right? Is what instead of embracing it or trying to embrace it, maybe like Republicans did when the Tea Party was, in a full-throated movement. So, what should Democrats do about the movement? Or should they do anything? And what did the Hong candidacy ultimately mean, Tanya?
Well, we should embrace it. I think what we need to do is try to build our coalition and make our tent as big as possible. And so that's going to include a lot of hopefully all of the Fran supporters who supported Hong, right down to the never Trumpers, we're going to have to bring them all in. I mean, this race is probably going to be close. Wisconsin races always are. And in order for us to be effective in this race and in races in the future, we're going to have to figure out a way to bring all those folks in.
Okay, Keith, what about the comparison to the Tea Party movement and what the Republicans did when that came on the fore? Is that an apt comparison?
In some ways, yes. Others, no. But I mean, the reality is each party has to go through this in certain ways, in its constant evolution in modern politics, which is new movements are created within a party, and you have to find a way to Tanya's point, create a bigger tent and bring them back in if they're opposed to something, or find common areas of agreement where you can push policies that help them win. And it took a while for the Republican Party to kind of adjust to elements of the Tea Party in terms of what their platform was, what they were demanding, what they were asking for. We had to go through some of these evolutionary changes as well with Make America Great Again movement as well, and it's all about figuring out how you weave that coalition to win. And yeah, we're going to have a really tight election, and Republicans at the same time, well, we didn't have an in-your-face food fight for the entire state to observe and watch. We still have work we need to do in order to patch together that winning coalition. And this can come down to, 20, 30,000 votes plus or minus for each side to figure out if they're a winner or a loser come election day. And that's why it's so critically important to be out there the day after the primary, building that coalition, expanding the tent, bringing voters in, making your case, and putting forward a very strong narrative about who you are as a candidate and who your opponent is and what they stand for.
So Charles, we'll come back to you, Tanya. Charles, the socialist movement was pretty prominent in Wisconsin, especially in Milwaukee in the early part of the last century. And so I don't think all that has, and then there came the progressive, and then there was the progressive movement as well. And I don't think that element of Wisconsin politics has left us. It's maybe evolved. I mean, do you have any thoughts about what Hong's candidacy means going forward?
Yeah, I think the growth of the folks that are clearly to the very far left or the far left, I don't mean that as a pejorative term, but a descriptive term, that's grown in the Democratic Party. 15 years ago, when we started the Marquette poll, about 13% of Democrats called themselves very liberal. Today, that's 26%. So it's doubled over this 15 years. Now, 26% is still a distinct minority in the party, but it's certainly big enough to have a strong influence, especially in primary races. The question, I think, going forward is the Democratic Socialist label a helpful one for candidates or parties, or is it something that has real limitations? We saw Mamdani win in New York City. You saw in New York primary races, socialist candidates winning again in Manhattan, and then in Colorado in the Denver Congressional District. But what all those have in common is they are small areas of very, very Democratic areas. And what we saw in Michigan and in Wisconsin in statewide races where you don't have just the isthmus voting or you don't have just Ann Arbor voting is that a state is a much more heterogeneous place. And trying to succeed with a distinctively progressive or socialist agenda is much, much harder in big constituencies than it is in small, compact, already very democratic areas. So I think that's a warning about how far you can go with it. Also, in both our state and national polling, we find only about 25% that say they have a favorable view to the term democratic socialist. A lot of people don't have an opinion about it at all. It's kind of a new term for many voters, but the balance is clearly negative, even without the haven't heard enough group.
Okay, Tanya.
Well, I was just going to sort of add to what we were talking about before about, what we need to do with that now. I mean, we could be in a recount right now. Had Fran Hong decided that she was going to fight this and that, we could be in a recount right now. And the way that she handled this was really classy. I'll just say, I mean, she called him, it was early on Wednesday morning, but she called him. She could have asked for a recount. She didn't. And then right away yesterday, she's sitting right by him at the Unity breakfast. And I think, that bodes very well for her bringing her voters into the Crowley tent.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you this, Tanya. I was looking at the counties that she won and he won. So in Kenosha County, she won. That was sort of the only one on the eastern seaboard, except for Brown up in the valley. She won won the valley, won western Wisconsin, and but he won Waukesha. So I don't know. How do all those jigsaw puzzles fit together for the fall?
It's hard. Democratic primary voters, we're kind of odd ducks. So I don't know. Well, they fit together just perfectly with only, a 3,000 vote difference across the state is how they fit together for this time. I don't know that I have much to say about sort of where these supporters were. I guess Kenosha, I was a little bit surprised that she took that county on that side of the state. But it was close. It was close everywhere too. I don't think we had any counties where there was a giant blowout either. So, I'm not sure much can be said about, or maybe others can think of things to say about sort of that combination. But I think what it does show is hopefully the voters that she had and all of their enthusiasm will be quickly transferred over into to the Crowley camp. I do think that part of a big motivating factor here is who Tom Tiffany is. Democrats are scared of him in terms of what Wisconsin would be like if he ended up being our governor. So that is a very big motivator for Democrats, is to try to make sure that we're doing everything that we can to keep this seat in Democratic hands.
Do we know if Hong will campaign with Crowley?
I think she already did. She was there yesterday, and I think they've been talking about doing that. I think, the Crowley team is a very smart team, and they will figure out where and when that makes the most sense.
Okay, Keith, what's the Republican mission from a campaign point of view this fall to win the governorship?
Well, I think it's just getting back to basics in terms of building out a coalition and developing your narrative for your candidate. I think a lot of people would admit that, Tom had an opportunity to kind of define himself early with his TV ad buys, and he's done that, and done it very effectively. And in other previous races, our biggest challenge as Republicans has been the amount of money that the Democratic Party and candidates have had, and an opportunity when we're dealing with primaries that to define themselves before going in and defining their opponent. So Tom's number one job, first and foremost, I would say has been accomplished, which is there is a developed image of him as a candidate and who he is, both personally and as an elected official, that he can now go take forward to the voters, as well as then starting to define his opponent, which he has started as of today, and do it in a thoughtful way that shows genuine contrasts of how they would approach, the job. I think one thing people have to be careful about is like trying to think through, Tom as a congressman versus David Crowley as a county executive. The reality here is that ultimately you're being interviewed for the job of governor, and my thesis statement has always been, when they send people to D.C. or they pick a U.S. senator, they don't necessarily have to like the person. What they want from that person is to go out and create problems in D.C. and try to get stuff done and disrupt the status quo. With governor, what they want to know is they like you, they understand you, they feel like they can have a beer with you. And I think that's an entirely different job interview than if you're running for Congress or U.S. Senate. And my, view of it is that, the Tiffany campaign has done a great job of showing who Tom is as a person, making him relatable, and given some of his biographical and life lessons from his mother and from his family as a part of that campaign. It gives him a great spot then to pivot into starting to talk to the voters about a contrast between what he would bring to the table as governor and those policies versus what Crowley would bring to the governorship and his policies. And there's a pretty clear contrast. In most modern day campaigns, there is a pretty clear contrast, especially in the last several election cycles between both parties. So I expect that they're working feverishly to get out there, be available, build coalitions, and get that winning margin.
Okay, so it's the midterms though, and Trump is underwater here, and Trump has endorsed uh, Tiffany, and Tiffany hasn't really separated himself from Trump at all that I have seen. So is that a problem?
I don't think you need to. I mean, they're entirely two different worlds in terms of the difference I see right now is that we don't have a U.S. Senate race here. And so there isn't, 100, 200, $300 million being spent on TV ads talking about federal issues and Iran war and Donald Trump. It is really a conversation about state issues, and those are entirely different issues. And yes, the political environment's going to be challenging. I don't discount that in any way, shape, or form. But we have an opportunity to have a conversation about what it means to be governor of the state of Wisconsin and the issues that, Tom Tiffany can put forward that have impacts on families here as governor and specifically through state government. So I think that's the differentiation. I feel bad for other states that have a U.S. Senate race going on because it interjects federal level policy, political environments, and Donald Trump directly into races, potentially in those states. I just feel like there's an opportunity and a dynamic in which Tom can, be the exception to the rule in a traditional midterm of, the power or the party in power and the presidency loses in the midterms. There are exceptions to the rule. 2022 for Tony Evers was an exception to the rule. Tom Tiffany could be an exception to the rule as well.
Okay, I think Tanya has something to say about this.
Yeah, I think, there's no reason that Tom Tiffany is going to be the exception to the rule, though. He votes with Donald Trump literally hand in hand. He votes with him 100% of the time. And, Tiffany is running up a steep hill with the Trump anvil around his neck. I mean, Trump has never been more unpopular across the country and here. And he also has to contend with his voting record. Tom Tiffany has a very distinct voting record. And not only the political environment, but the economic environment. Gas prices, increasing healthcare costs, all at the time when Tom Tiffany has voted to kick people off of healthcare and increase premiums for, hundreds of thousands of Wisconsinites. And that's not even mentioning the tariffs and that are driving up prices for everyday Wisconsinites, but also specifically for Wisconsin's farmers. And then some of the social issues and this is a guy who supports a 0-week abortion ban with no exceptions. That is gravely out of line with where most Wisconsinites are. And not to mention the election denier stuff. I mean, this is a guy who still can't say who won the 2020 election, and thinks that giving money, not that the January 6th rioters should be punished, but he actually wants to give them money. There couldn't be a starker contrast between David Crowley and Tom Tiffany. And so I hear you, Keith, when there always can be exceptions to the rule, but I think it is going to be very difficult for Tom Tiffany to be that exception.
I'm just saying, if we're going to do an oppo dump,
exceptions.
if we're going to do an oppo dump, then I'll start on David Crowley. Double-digit property tax increases, doubling of the sales tax, deficits across county government, an inability to renew a healthcare policy for the county workers of Milwaukee shows, basic incompetence in managing government. These are things to have a conversation about with the voters as well. So just want to make the point, you can say all those things about Tom. I got plenty to say about David. The voters will ultimately decide. So.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
And yeah.
Okay, so we'll get into this. Okay, so Charles, though, how do you see this matchup occurring in terms of issues that are, or is there? Do you think that there are? Is the Trump effect going to be weighing heavily on Tiffany or not? Is the affordability issue a big asset for Crowley?
Yeah, first let me say, Keith said evaluating a governor is who do you want to have a beer with. I think Tom wants it to be about who you can have an old fashioned with, which, next to beer may be the best thing to propose to Wisconsin voters. I think the ad campaign for Tiffany over the summer was terrific in terms of softening his image. He said very little about issues, but he stressed common sense, which is a good way to say, I'm not telling you anything about my policies, but they're going to be common sense. So I think that's a smart strategy over the summer to soften the image. For the fall, obviously, there will be two sides to this argument, and you just heard them from Keith and Tanya, and that will just build. I do want to say that in our polling of what's the most important issue facing you today, inflation and the cost of living is at the top of the charts and has been at the top of the charts since 2022 when inflation spiked under Joe Biden. People don't see that issue as having gone away. And Trump's job approval on inflation is now in the low 20s, and it's only 30% on handling the economy. The economic issue was a big asset for Trump throughout the first term, but it's a big anchor on him and I would say his party in the second term. So I agree with Keith that without a Senate race that would buy gazillions of gross ratings points, heightening those national issues, it'll be very much up to the two governors' campaigns to decide how they want to talk about this. But the priority of economic issues doesn't just stop with inflation and jobs. In the top of our list, number two is immigration and border security. But the other four top issues are health insurance, property taxes, and other economic concerns. So I don't see how either campaign gets away without talking a good bit about those broadly economic and affordability issues, and how do they convince voters that they are A, concerned about those things, and B, what do they do in state policy to try to affect that?
Okay, before we move on to the audience questions, in audience, you can go to your chat box there at the bottom and type in your question, and I'll maybe group the ones that are there, or I'll just state the question. But please type your questions in now if you can. So before we go there, I want to ask all of you about, did anything happen in the primary or that to maybe inform us what might happen in the race for the legislature. Republicans have had control of the legislature for a long time. Democrats have been talking about a trifecta, meaning they'd have the governor's office, liberals would control the Supreme Court, and Democrats would control both houses of the legislature. That hasn't happened in, well, the control of the state house really hasn't happened since Doyle left in 2010, and Walker and Republicans won in that November. But what have we seen in the primaries that might inform us about what might happen in the legislature, in the legislative races? Keith.
Well, generally speaking, I think it comes down to, ultimately doors and dollars. You got to raise money and you got to knock on doors with voters. I think the success the Assembly Republican caucus has had in holding the majority has been largely due to good candidate recruitment, their candidates getting out on the doors and meeting voters one on one where they live, and that has a huge impact. And if they have the financial resources, then to run quality campaigns with good messaging, et cetera, I think they'll be set up as well to potentially hold the assembly. The state senate is a little more complicated. The geography is bigger. There's less districts to work with in terms of holding their majority. But again, it comes down to the quality of the candidate, dollars raised and doors knocked. And I think the biggest thing you could do to give Republicans a chance to hold the Senate would be to get out on those doors and just pound them relentlessly and have your candidates meet the people one on one, meet the voters. And so that's what I expect. I don't know that there's anything that I'd specifically point to in terms of the primaries, but broadly speaking, this conversation about the, Democratic Socialist Party, their policies, their agendas, their ideas are going to get infused across the state in terms of conversations with Democrat candidates for the Assembly and Senate. So there's going to be an infusion of that, and obviously they'll try to infuse MAGA and Donald Trump into the Republican side. So, each of these races probably becomes more of a microcosm of the bigger, broader debate in the governorship. And ultimately, the tighter the race is at the top of the ticket in terms of governorship and what that margin looks like, probably dictates, success and failure in many of these legislative races down ballot.
Yeah, I think a fear of the of Democratic moderates was that a Hong campaign, if she could win very narrowly, and that would hurt the effort to take over the assembly. Tanya, what's your view on whether the primary is informing us or helping
Yeah.
Democrats in terms of the legislative
Well,
races?
I think, yeah, you are exactly right. I think there was a concern by a lot of Democrats that Hong at the top of the ticket would not be helpful and may even be harmful to the races, to the targeted races that we need to win. However, the Crowley path to victory in November is in the suburbs and holding down, sort of Republican margins in rural communities and in small towns. And that actually fits up very nicely with where those targeted legislative seats are. So it matches up very nicely. So I actually think both chambers are the Democrats for the taking this year, now that we actually have fair maps. And
Okay,
I said that for
I as the host screwed up. The chat function is disabled, so go to the Q&A function. Oh man, we need a new host. All right. Let me go to some questions. I did have this question emailed me to yesterday. I don't know how many times I've heard over the years about an open primary, the crossover vote. Would Republicans cross over and vote for Hong? Was there any evidence of that? Tiffany said don't do that, but that wouldn't mean that people couldn't do it. Was there a crossover, any evidence of crossover voting, or does crossover voting ever matter in your view, Keith?
I have just, having been around Wisconsin politics now for nearly 28 years, I can say in my time, I've never seen it actually work. I don't believe people actually do it. I should qualify that. I think there are probably a few people out there thinking, yeah, I'm going to go do that. But I don't think it's in a substantial, statistically important number of people. And look, we have open primaries and there's no party registration in this state. So I don't know how you even could quantify it if it did happen. If we were talking about a difference of 50 votes between Francesca Hong and David Crowley, then maybe. If you're talking about 4,000, it's little to none impact on the overall race at the end of the day.
Professor, any evidence of crossover voting ever having an effect to your knowledge?
Now, I'm with Keith on this. I think it's something that, there's enormous schemes for that on Twitter. But in practice, most people don't think that way. In our early July poll, we asked your partisanship and which primary you were going to vote in, and we got 4 to 6% of the Democratic primary voters saying they were Republicans in party identification. So a modest crossover vote. But the really interesting thing is that the majority of those folks weren't going for Hong. They were going for Joel Brennan and Sarah Rodriguez at that time, the less extreme candidates, and certainly not the candidate that the Twitter conspiracy theory said they should all go in and back. And I think that just is the reality of what normal people think about. That if they're going to cross over, most of them, not all of them, but most of them are going over to sincerely vote for the candidate that if they were going to vote Democratic, they would prefer that candidate rather than strategically stick the Democrats with a less electable candidate. So I don't think there's much evidence of it, and I don't think it's nearly as widespread or as effective as what the fantasies of Twitter folks make it out to be.
Okay. It's called X now, anyway.
Yeah, I'm an old guy. It's
All right.
it's still
So,
National Airport, but maybe
okay.
it's Reagan.
Yeah, it'll always be National Airport to me. I'll tell you
Yeah.
that.
Okay. So this,
I just want to just add it to that topic, though. I just want to say that I think, real voters take voting very seriously. And so the nefarious things, they're not into it.
okay.
It's people take their vote very seriously, I think. And I just don't think that works. There may be a few people on the edges that might like to, but not the masses.
Okay. So this is a question for you, Tanya, I think. Were Hong a less compromised candidate due to, quote, woke comments? Would Evers still have entered the primary with support for someone else?
Yeah, I think so. I think the way things played out, I think what you're referring to is maybe some of the I'll call them tweets, because I don't know what to call them. X's? Do you call them X's when they're an X if they're
We'll
not
have
tweet?
to
I don't
ask
know.
Elon Musk that.
Yeah. No, Keith might be able to do that. So I think Evers was planning on, I think Evers wasn't planning early on at the very beginning of this to do this, but I do think that um, I think he would have gotten engaged either way, whether she had the Thanksgiving or Valentine's or whatever tweets or not.
Could he have been involved earlier and saved us from a crazy, chaotic primary?
He could have, but I think what he did was exactly the right time.
Okay. All right, here's a general question for everyone. What is your assessment of Tiffany's record as a state legislator, and does that matter much more now that he's running for governor? Keith.
Look, there's nothing that doesn't get exposed in a campaign. That's the whole point of a campaign. You vet your votes, you vet your characteristic, your values, what you endorse for policies. So yeah, it'll have an impact, just like his federal congressional record will have an impact. And David Crowley was in the state legislature as well. So his votes there will be brought to bear. His budget proposals in Milwaukee will be talked about as well. So all of this is fair game, at the end of the day. And, whether it's, state legislative, federal, county, whatever, all of it's going to be part of the conversation in this campaign.
Okay, so probably his landmark or his most notable piece of legislation is the pro-mining bill, but that didn't result, I don't think, in a new mine in northern Wisconsin. So anyway, do you have any view on his legislative record, Tanya? Because you were dipping into the Oppo file, I can see that.
Well,
Um,
Are you talking about Crowley or are you talking
No, no.
about Tiffany? I've dipped into both. So, but my point
I
would be
mean,
just like this is all going to be aired no matter what, and we're going to have conversations about all of it. And, yeah.
yeah, and I would just add on the specific vote that you brought up on the mining vote. I think, that probably that I don't know if that specifically will be brought up, but it does fit into the narrative that that he is for special interests in corporations and not for you. So I wouldn't be surprised to maybe see that vote as a sort of a part of the narrative of that.
Do we like cars? Do we like phones? Do we like laptops? Well, that stuff's got to come from someplace. Would you rather it be here from America or do you want it someplace else? Because at least we have environmental
Actually,
regulations
stuff
that are
like
proper.
that dangerous stuff, somewhere else.
Okay.
I just always want environmentalists to admit it when they show up with their iPhone and their Prius. Where does this stuff come from and how do they get it? Let's talk
You
about
know,
China and
Oh,
Africa.
that's a whole nother show. Okay. So here's a
and
question.
I don't have an iPhone. I have a Samsung, and I don't have a Prius. So
Oh, all right. Well, you pass the test. You pass Keith's test. All right.
yeah, thank you.
For Dems, this is a question, and questioners, I'm going with the those who put their names on there first. That raises the level of importance for me. But for Dems, is there a concern that the Francesca Hong voters in the primary will not turn out for Crowley in the general, much like we saw far left voters stay home and refuse to vote for Kamala Harris over Israel, Hamas issues, etc.? Or does that issue not make it to a state level race? Charles, do you have any inkling
Yeah.
on that?
Yeah, I have a little bit. I think, first of all, the unity tour and the things that Fran Hong talked about on election night and the day after all point to genuine support on her part. It hasn't so far been grudging to my ear, at least. So I think that's pretty important. Um, I think the contrast between Crowley and Tiffany will also mean that those folks have a hard time sitting on the sidelines. I want to mention that one thing about turnout in the primary because I don't think it makes any sense to compare Republican primary turnout to Democratic primary turnout because obviously the Republicans didn't have a very intense race. But I do think you got to take a moment to appreciate that the Democratic primary had 790,000 people vote. If you jump back to 2018, the last time we had an open many candidate gubernatorial race, that was 539,000 people. So this was remarkably high turnout in a chaotic primary, but one that really motivated Democratic voters to turn out. And my point here is that polling all year, including mine, has shown Democrats with a modest edge, maybe a 5 to 8 point edge, in expected turnout in the fall, enthusiasm as we measure it. Um, I think the primary turnout showed that Democrats really are very enthusiastic about voting, and Republicans somewhat less, not from their primary turnout, but from the survey questions. The one thing I think about Republicans, though, is that the survey responses probably underestimate where Republican enthusiasm will be in the fall. Because despite Tom's very effective ad campaign over the summer, the lack of a competitive race just isn't boosting Republican enthusiasm. And I do think the president, the Gulf War, the economy are drags on Republican enthusiasm. But I'm sure that for the next, what is it, 83 days, 84 days, um, the Republican campaign will be doing a great job of mobilizing Republican voters. So an interesting question will be whether Democrats maintain that turnout edge that they've had all year, or whether it shrinks or perhaps evens out by November.
So, Tanya, do you have anything about the comparison to the Harris campaign and her inability maybe to move the far left voters to her camp?
No, I think, I don't. I think that we're going to have to work hard. But we are pretty good, particularly in Wisconsin. Wisconsin Democrats are pretty good at turnout. And I also think that, I just don't see that happening in this race. Will there be a few? Will those few be vocal? Of course. But I think the majority of Wisconsin Democratic primary voters are going to come over to Crowley with relative ease.
Okay, there is a request here to talk about the third CD and the seventh CD races. I didn't have that on my hit list. I should have. Third is nationally targeted. That's Western Wisconsin with Derek Van Orden. And Tiffany's seat is the seventh because it's open because he's running for governor. And that was won by Michael Alfonso. So, Keith, why don't you tell us about the seventh primary since it looks like, unless we don't know something, that's still a red seat and will probably stay red.
Don't view that as a competitive seat whatsoever. Michael Alfonso, obviously, son-in-law to Sean Duffy, benefited from the Duffy's endorsement, the support, their networks. It's common in my estimation, generally speaking, that the candidate that has the most spent on their behalf in a primary typically win. And Michael Alfonso had the most. And so he was able to cover a lot of ground in terms of those ads, which is the seventh is a very big district at the end of the day. And so that's why I think ultimately he was successful there. In the third, Derek Van Orden, nothing new here. He's always on the hot seat every single election cycle. And every cycle, the Dems say they're going to get him. And I always make the comment, I can tell you exactly, going back almost 40 years, who the congressmen are in the third, which is where I'm from. It was Steve Gunderson, Ron Kine, Derek Van Orden. I'm covering 40 years there. So it doesn't happen very often that they get rid of a congressman, and mainly the times that they've gotten rid of the congressman is only because they retired. So we're going to have this conversation. They're going to talk about the political environment. I just have a view of having come from South and Southwestern Wisconsin, Western Wisconsin. It's one of those see here, talk to kind of situations like that. That district, they want to see their congressman. They want to understand they're working hard for them. Ultimately, I think he'll be successful. This is just another rematch. You'll see it all reprised. Yes, it was tight, but the reality is, I think Derek Van Orden's going to win because he's shown how he can win every single election cycle that he's been up for re-election. And we'll see.
Okay, Tanya, I think you probably have a different view.
Yeah, not really on the seventh, but certainly on the third. I do. I don't think the Tiffany, another Republican congressman running for governor is really going to help him. Because I think a lot of the votes that Tom Tiffany's going to be criticized for are votes that Derek Van Orden also made in lockstep. Although I think Derek Van Orden is even a little more conservative in MAGA, if that's even possible, than Tom Tiffany. So I think this is the year for us to retake the third.
Well, and I think, I mean, answer me this, pundits. I mean, if Democrats don't win that seat, will they control Congress? Or control the House? I mean, this seat is really that emblematic of how Democrats have to do in November, isn't it?
It's certainly important, that's for sure. It's pivotal. I don't know. I think we can still get the majority in the U.S. House without getting the third. But it's certainly pivotal.
All right, we're
There's
coming
better
up near the
districts.
end. Oh, go ahead, Keith. Sorry,
I
what?
was just going to say there's better districts out there for Democrats than the third. So, I mean, the reality is it's a small margin right now for the House. This is like 3 or 4, depending on who's alive or dead these days for congressmen. um, I think that's a very precarious position, especially with the national political environment, with traditional midterms. The pool of competitive seats has shrunk, but it's still probably in the Dems' favor ultimately. And they need to win, probably a third of the competitive districts, and they'd be in power, and that's about it.
Okay. Well, we're coming up to the close here, and I'm just, I guess I want to ask you, what is the issue or the thing that's really going to like be the difference? Is it the quality of the candidate? Is it Trump? Is it Evers? Is it data centers? What is the thing that's going to tip the election if you had to pick one? Keith.
Campaign message. What are they going to do and how they're going to help your family? We all know affordability is the number one conversation. And so far, I think Tom's tackling it head on in terms of what are all the things he's for and what are the things he's against. And those are things that are going to have impacts directly on families and their pocketbooks. And that's what I think is going to ultimately be the conversation that drives, who's voting for who at the end of the day. So I always come back to run a good campaign with a good message and make sure you have enough money to make sure every voter hears it and you can win.
Tanya.
Yeah, I think the economic environment is going to be the key factor here. If I had to pick one, that would be what it would be.
Okay. Charles.
Same. Economy, cost of living, but play it very different ways. Who's going to really go after property taxes and lowering those versus who's going to go after working class values and things that would help workers. I think you can obviously see the two parties going in different directions. Right at the moment, Crowley is emphasizing working to get things done. Maybe that's a good story, but you need to say what you're working to get done. And we'll see how that evolves in the next week or two as the campaigns actually begin to ramp up.
Okay. Well, we did it all in an hour. I really want to thank our panelists. You're all pros. Thanks very much. I want to thank our sponsors for the Milwaukee events. UW Milwaukee, Medical College of Wisconsin, the Wisconsin Transportation Builders Association, and HBS Wisconsin. So this is Jeff Maris from WisPolitics.com and State Affairs signing off, and we'll see you next time.